My name is Daniel, and I never thought I'd be sharing something like this. But after what happened to me, I can't stay silent. I was just an ordinary guy, living an ordinary life. Work, friends, weekends, that's all I cared about. Faith? That was something for Sundays, if I even bothered to go to church. I wasn't a bad person, at least I didn't think so. I tried to be kind, to do the right thing when I could. But God? He wasn't really part of my daily life. I figured I had plenty of time to figure all that out later. That was before the accident. It was a Tuesday morning, just like any other. I woke up late, as usual, rushing to get ready for work. I grabbed my coffee, my bag, and headed out the door. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, everything seemed normal, but deep down I felt this strange unease, like something was off. I brushed it off, thinking it was just stress from work or maybe too much coffee. I got in my car and started driving, the radio playing some upbeat song I didn't really care about. My mind was elsewhere, thinking about deadlines, bills, all the usual stuff. I didn't notice the truck speeding toward me until it was too late. The last thing I remember is the sound of screeching tires, the flash of headlights, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my car anymore. I wasn't even on Earth. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, cold, and terrifying. That's when I realized I was dead. The impact was sudden, violent, and completely unexpected. One moment I was driving down the road, lost in my thoughts, and the next I was thrown into chaos. The sound of metal crunching, glass shattering, and my own voice screaming filled the air. Time seemed to slow down as my car spun out of control, the world outside a blur of colors and shapes. I remember the sensation of being weightless, like I was floating, and then the harsh jolt as my car slammed into something solid. Pain exploded through my body, sharp and unrelenting, but it didn't last long. Within seconds, everything went silent. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the wreckage, the paramedics, the flashing lights. But instead, I was somewhere else. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I was floating in a dark, endless void. There was no ground beneath my feet, no sky above me, just an infinite expanse of nothingness. I tried to move, to call out, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, and then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, barely visible at first, but growing brighter with every passing second. It was warm, inviting, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I wanted to go toward it, to escape the darkness, but something held me back. That's when I heard the voices, whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew. They weren't friendly. They were coming from all around me, closing in, and I felt a cold, creeping dread that made my skin crawl. I tried to run, to fight, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, helpless, as the voices grew louder, more menacing. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the light returned, brighter than ever, and a figure stepped out of it. It was Jesus. I knew it was him before he even spoke. There was no doubt in my mind. His presence was overwhelming, filling the void with a light so pure it seemed to chase away every shadow. But it wasn't just the light, it was the way he looked at me. His eyes were filled with a love so deep, so unconditional, that it made my chest ache. "Daniel," he said, and his voice was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling, a vibration that resonated deep within me. "You are here because there is something you need to see." I wanted to ask questions, to understand what was happening, but before I could speak, the darkness around us shifted. The void dissolved, and I found myself standing in a vast, dimly lit room. At the center was a large, round table, surrounded by figures I couldn't quite make out. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but I could feel their power, their authority. They were speaking, their voices low and urgent, but I couldn't understand the words. Then one of them said something that made my blood run cold. "The time is near. The world will soon be ready." I didn't know what they were talking about, but I could feel the weight of their words, the gravity of whatever they were planning. And then Jesus spoke again. "This is what is coming, Daniel, and the world is not ready." Jesus stepped closer, his presence filling the room with a warmth that pushed back the shadows. I wanted to look away, to hide from the intensity of his gaze, but I couldn't. His eyes held me, piercing through every layer of my being, exposing every thought, every action, every sin. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. I shook my head, unable to speak. He raised his hand, and suddenly I was no longer in the room. I was standing in a vast, open space, surrounded by visions of the future. First vision was of a world in chaos. Cities burned, people screamed, and the earth itself seemed to be tearing apart. I saw wars, famine, and natural disasters on a scale I couldn't comprehend. It was like watching the end of the world, and I felt a deep, aching sorrow for the people suffering. The second vision was of a man, a leader. He was charismatic, powerful, and people flocked to him, believing he was the answer to their problems. But as I watched, I saw the darkness in his eyes, the lies behind his smile. He wasn't there to save them, he was there to control them. The third vision was the most terrifying. I saw a book, a massive glowing book, floating in the air. Jesus opened it, and I saw names written in light, some shining brightly, others fading away. I realized with a sinking feeling that this was the Book of Life, and the names that faded were those of people who had turned away from God. "This is what is coming," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "and the world is not ready." I wanted to ask questions, to understand more, but before I could, the visions faded, and I was back in the void. "You must warn them," Jesus said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Tell them what you have seen. The time is near and the door will soon close." Before I could respond, the void around me shifted again. This time, I was standing in the middle of a city, but it wasn't like any city I'd ever seen. The streets were empty, the buildings crumbling, and the sky was a sickly shade of red. The air was thick with smoke, and the only sound was the distant wail of sirens. I turned, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and that's when I noticed the people. They were huddled together in small groups, their faces filled with fear and desperation. Some were crying, others were praying, but most just stared into the distance, their eyes empty. "This is what happens when the world turns away from me," Jesus said, his voice filled with sorrow. "This is the future if they do not repent." I wanted to look away, to escape the horror of what I was seeing, but I couldn't. The images kept coming, one after another, each more terrifying than the last. I saw a massive storm, unlike anything I'd ever imagined. It tore through cities, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. I saw people running, screaming, trying to escape, but there was no escape. I saw a war, not between nations, but between people. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families, torn apart by hatred and fear. The streets were filled with violence, and there was no one to stop it. And then I saw the worst of it, a darkness, deeper and more terrifying than anything I'd ever experienced. It spread across the land, consuming everything in its path. I could feel it, a cold, suffocating presence that seemed to drain the life out of everything it touched. "This is the end," Jesus said, his voice heavy with grief. "This is what happens when the world rejects me." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. How could anyone survive this? How could anyone escape? But then Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "You must warn them," he said. "Tell them what you have seen. The time is near and the door will soon close." I wanted to argue, to tell him that no one would believe me, that they'd think I was crazy. But before I could speak, Jesus raised his hand, and I felt a surge of warmth spread through me. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I will be with you, but you must act quickly. The time is short and many are in danger." His words filled me with a sense of urgency, but also with a strange peace. I knew what I had to do, even if I didn't know how. "Tell them to turn back," Jesus continued. "Tell them to seek me while I may still be found. Warn them of what is coming, and remind them that my love is greater than their sins. But they must choose. They must decide." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know how I would do it, but I knew I had to try. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision ended. The light faded, the warmth disappeared, and I was plunged back into darkness. But this time it was different. I could feel my body again, the weight of it, the pain. I heard voices, distant and muffled, calling my name. "Daniel, can you hear me? Stay with us." I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was the bright light of the hospital room. I was back, but I wasn't the same. The light was blinding, and I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to my surroundings. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nose, and the beeping of machines echoed in my ears. I was in a hospital room, surrounded by doctors and nurses who were frantically working to stabilize me. "He's back! We have a pulse!" one of the nurses shouted, her voice filled with relief. I tried to speak, to tell them what I had seen, but my throat was dry, and my voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Water," I managed to croak. A nurse quickly brought a cup with a straw, and I drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing my parched throat. As I drank, I glanced around the room, half expecting to see Jesus standing there, watching over me. But he wasn't there. It was just me and the medical staff. "You're lucky to be alive," one of the doctors said, his tone serious. "You were gone for 3 minutes. We weren't sure we'd be able to bring you back." 3 minutes. That was all it had taken to change my life forever. I wanted to tell them everything about the void, the visions, Jesus, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. They'd think I was hallucinating, that the trauma of the accident had messed with my mind. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes. As the doctors continued to check my vitals, I closed my eyes, trying to process everything that had happened. The images of the future, the warning from Jesus, the urgency in his voice, it all played over and over in my mind. I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had to tell someone, anyone, about what I had seen. But where would I even start? The days after I woke up were a blur. Doctors and nurses came and went, asking questions, running tests, and making sure I was stable. My family visited, their faces filled with relief and concern. But I could tell they didn't fully understand what I had been through. I tried to tell them, to explain what I had seen, but the words felt inadequate. How could I describe the void, the visions, the overwhelming presence of Jesus? How could I make them understand the urgency of his warning? It was like nothing I've ever experienced, I said, my voice trembling. "I saw things that are going to happen. We need to be ready. We need to turn back to God." My parents exchanged worried glances, and my younger brother looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Daniel, you've been through a lot," my mom said gently. "Maybe it's just the trauma. You should rest, focus on getting better." I wanted to argue, to make them see, but I knew it was no use. They weren't ready to hear it. As the days passed, I tried to push the experience to the back of my mind, to focus on my recovery. But the visions kept coming back, haunting my dreams and filling my thoughts. I couldn't escape them. One night, as I lay in my hospital bed, I decided to write everything down. Maybe if I put it into words, I could make sense of it. I grabbed a notebook and started writing, pouring out every detail. The void, the visions, the warning from Jesus. When I was done, I felt a sense of relief, but also a growing determination. I couldn't keep this to myself. I had to share it, no matter what anyone thought. The next day, I asked one of the nurses if I could use her phone to record a video. She hesitated, but after seeing the urgency in my eyes, she agreed. I sat up, in bed, took a deep breath and started recording. "My name is Daniel, and I died for 3 minutes," I began, my voice steady despite the fear and doubt swirling inside me. "In those 3 minutes, I saw things that changed my life forever. I saw the future, and it's not something we're ready for. But there's still time. We can still turn back. We can still choose God." I poured my heart into that video, sharing everything I had seen and heard. When I was done, I uploaded it to social media, not knowing if anyone would believe me, but knowing I had to try. At first, nothing happened. The video got a few views, a couple of comments, but most people seemed to ignore it. I felt a pang of disappointment, but I told myself it didn't matter. I had done what I could, but then things started to change. A few days after I posted the video, I noticed a black SUV parked outside the hospital. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I saw it again the next day. And the day after that, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside my door. They stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a small, black device that looked like a remote. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Daniel," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And now you've become a problem." I tried to sit up, to call for help, but before I could, he pressed a button on the device, and a sharp, piercing sound filled the room. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a noise that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I dropped to the bed, clutching my head as the sound grew louder, more intense, my vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was the man stepping closer, his cold eyes staring down at me. "Sleep tight, Daniel," he said. "When you wake up, you'll wish you'd stayed out of this." And then everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, and for a moment I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered. The man, the device, the sound. I sat up, my hands shaking, and looked around. The room was empty, but the door was slightly ajar. I could hear voices in the hallway, low and urgent, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I knew I had to get out of there. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the pain that shot through my body, and grabbed my phone. I didn't have much time. As I stood up, I noticed something on the bedside table, a small, white envelope. My hands trembled as I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a message typed in bold letters: "You were warned." I dropped the paper like it had burned me, my mind racing. They had been here in my room while I was unconscious. The voices in the hallway grew louder, and I knew I had to move. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out of the room, staying close to the wall as I made my way to the stairwell. My heart was pounding as I descended the stairs, each step bringing me closer to freedom. But I knew this wasn't over. They would come after me again. When I reached the ground floor, I pushed open the door and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to warn people, to tell them what I had seen. As I walked, I pulled out my phone and started recording another video. "My name is Daniel, and I died for 3 minutes, I began, my voice steady despite the fear and exhaustion. "In those 3 minutes, I saw things that changed my life forever. I saw the future, and it's not something we're ready for. But there's still time. We can still turn back. We can still choose God." I uploaded the video as I walked, not knowing if anyone would believe me, but knowing I had to try. I didn't know how long I walked, but eventually I found myself in a quiet park. The night was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. I sat down on a bench, my body aching, my mind racing. I checked my phone, hoping to see some response to the video I had just uploaded. There were a few views, a couple of comments, but nothing significant. I felt a pang of frustration, but I told myself it didn't matter. I had done what I could. As I sat there, I noticed a figure approaching from the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up ready to run. But then I recognized the face. It was my friend, Mark. "Daniel," he said, his voice filled with concern. "What are you doing out here? Are you okay?" I wanted to tell him everything, to make him understand, but I knew it was no use. He wouldn't believe me. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just needed some fresh air." Mark nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He sat down next to me, and for a while we just sat there in silence, watching the stars. But then I noticed something. A black SUV parked across the street. My heart started to race, and I knew I had to go. "I have to leave," I said, standing up. Mark looked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" "I can't explain," I said, my voice trembling. "Just be careful, okay? And if you see anything strange, anything at all, call me." Mark nodded, still confused, but I didn't have time to explain. I turned and started walking, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked, I noticed the SUV following me, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I quickened my pace, but the SUV kept coming closer and closer. I knew I couldn't outrun it. And then, just as the SUV was about to catch up to me, I heard a voice I recognized. "Daniel." I turned, and there he was, Jesus, standing. In the light, his eyes filled with love and determination. "It's not over," he said. "Keep fighting." And then the light faded, and I was alone again.